This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The winter of 1794 arrived early in the Connecticut River Valley. By late October, frost had already claimed the last of the harvest, and the merchant families of Hartford County began their preparations for the long months ahead. Among them were the Pembertons, a family whose name appeared on shipping manifests, property deeds, and church records with the kind of frequency that suggested both prosperity and permanence. Cornelius Pemberton had built his fortune through trade: textiles from England, rum from the Caribbean, timber from the northern forests. His estate, located 3 miles west of the town center along the post road, consisted of a main house, 2 barns, servants' quarters, and acreage that extended to the edge of the Farmington River. What made the Pemberton property distinctive was not its size, which was considerable, but not extraordinary for a merchant of Cornelius's standing, but rather its unusual construction. The main house had been erected in 1768, replacing an earlier structure that had burned under circumstances never fully explained in surviving records. The new building featured thick stone walls on the ground floor, an architectural choice that neighbors found curious given the predominance of wood construction in the region. More curious still was the cellar, which, according to the original builder's notes preserved in the Hartford County Archives, extended significantly deeper than typical root cellars of the period. The builder, a stonemason named Ephraim Caldwell, had been brought from Providence specifically for the project. His contract, discovered in municipal records during a 1958 archive reorganization, specified that he was to construct a cellar with particular dimensions and specifications as privately detailed by the proprietor, with chambers and divisions, according to plans not to be shared with other workmen or discussed publicly. Caldwell completed the work in 18 months, receiving payment substantially higher than standard rates. He returned to Rhode Island immediately upon completion and, according to Providence City directories, died in 1771 at the age of 49. His personal effects, auctioned to settle debts, included no records or drawings related to the Pemberton Commission. Cornelius Pemberton died in September of 1794 at the age of 63. The attending physician, Dr. Silas Worthington, noted in his medical journal that the death resulted from complications of pneumonia, though he added a marginal notation that has intrigued later researchers. Patient exhibited unusual agitation in final days, requesting repeatedly that certain portions of his estate remain undisturbed. Spoke of obligations that must be honored beyond death. In moments of fever, referenced agreements made during his travels to the Caribbean in 1766 prior to construction of current residence. Mentioned names I did not recognize, places that do not appear on any map I have consulted. Dr. Worthington's journal, preserved at the Connecticut Historical Society, contains additional observations about Cornelius's final illness. The physician noted that the merchant's symptoms did not entirely align with typical pneumonia progression. There were periods of extreme lucidity alternating with profound disorientation, during which Cornelius spoke in what Worthington described as a dialect or language unknown to me, possibly of West Indian origin, though the cadence suggested something older. The doctor also recorded that Cornelius insisted on having certain objects arranged around his bedside: a wooden box of unusual design, a worn leather journal, and a small brass key that he kept clutched in his hand until the moment of death. The funeral was attended by the prominent families of Hartford County, and Cornelius was interred in the family plot at the First Church Cemetery. His widow, Prudence Pemberton, was 58 at the time of her husband's death. She was known in the community as a reserved woman who managed household affairs with precision and rarely engaged in the social gatherings favored by other merchant wives. The Pembertons had no surviving offspring. 3 children had been born, but none lived past the age of 7. deaths attributed in parish records to scarlet fever and consumption. However, a notation in the parish register, made by Reverend Augustus Whitfield in 1783, adds complexity to this official account. Written in the margin beside the record of the third child's death, in smaller script than the main entry, the Reverend wrote, "The mother bears these losses with a fortitude that borders on resignation, as if she had long expected such outcomes. She declined my offer of special prayers for the children's souls, stating that their fates were determined long before their births, and no intercession can alter what has been agreed. I find this theology troubling and have counseled her against such fatalistic thinking, but she remains unmoved." This left Prudence as the sole inheritor of the Pemberton estate, a situation that required formal probate proceedings despite the absence of competing claims. The inventory of the estate, conducted in October 1794 by appointed assessors Josiah Crane and Nathaniel Harding, reveals the scope of Cornelius's holdings. The document, preserved in the Connecticut State Archives, lists furniture, silver, china, livestock, tools, stored goods, and various financial instruments totaling a value of approximately £4,000, a substantial fortune for the period. However, the inventory includes a notation that would later draw attention. Cellar storage area beneath main house, partially inaccessible due to locked door for which key was not provided by widow. Assessed value of accessible areas only, noted unusual construction of cellar chambers, with divisions suggesting purpose beyond standard storage. Temperature of accessible area notably lower than expected for season, and stone walls show evidence of moisture, despite absence of groundwater infiltration in surrounding properties. According to testimony given years later by Harding to a county magistrate, Prudence had been present during the inventory process. When the assessors reached the cellar and encountered the locked door, they requested access. Harding recalled her response as measured but firm. Her late husband had instructed that the secured portion of the cellar was never to be opened, that it contained only old business records and personal effects of no monetary value, and that she intended to honor his wishes. When Crane suggested that a complete inventory was legally required, Prudence produced a letter bearing Cornelius's signature and the seal of his attorney Thaddeus Blackmore, stating that certain portions of the estate were exempt from standard probate procedures due to ongoing business arrangements that would be jeopardized by disclosure. The assessors, finding no legal grounds to compel her and facing potential complications involving business confidentiality, noted the restriction and continued with their work. However, Harding later testified that he felt distinctly uneasy in the cellar, describing a sensation of being watched and a persistent cold that seemed to emanate from the locked door itself. He also noted that the door, while appearing to be standard wood construction, was unusually heavy and featured metalwork that seemed more elaborate than necessary for a simple storage room. The months following Cornelius's death passed without incident. Prudence maintained the household with the assistance of two servants, Ezra Hutchins, a man of approximately 40 years who served as general laborer and groundskeeper, and Margaret Wolcott, a woman in her 30s who managed domestic duties. Both had been in the Pemberton employ for several years. Parish records indicate that Prudence attended church services regularly, though witnesses noted she appeared increasingly withdrawn. Ezra Hutchins had entered the Pemberton employ in 1789, following the death of the previous groundskeeper, under circumstances that local gossip found suspicious. The man, Caleb Morton, had been found in the barn, apparently having fallen from the hayloft and broken his neck. The constable at the time ruled the death accidental, though Morton's wife claimed her husband had been agitated in the weeks before his death, speaking of strange sounds coming from beneath the main house and expressing a desire to leave the Pemberton service. She stated that Caleb had been offered substantially increased wages to remain, and financial necessity compelled him to accept despite his misgivings. Margaret Wolcott's history with the family was similarly marked by peculiarities. She had been hired in 1787 after the previous household manager, a woman named Patience Ridley, departed suddenly in the middle of the night, leaving behind all her possessions. Ridley was never located, though rumors circulated that she had been seen boarding a ship in New Haven, bound for England. Margaret herself rarely spoke about her life before entering the Pemberton household, and her references, supposedly from families in Massachusetts, could never be verified when later investigators attempted to trace them. The first indication that something might be amiss came in late February of 1795. Deacon Samuel Bradstreet, who lived a half-mile distant on the post road, reported to the local constable that he had not seen smoke from the Pemberton chimney for 3 consecutive days, unusual for the depths of winter. Concerned for the widow's welfare, Bradstreet and Constable Isaac Merritt traveled to the estate on the morning of February 27th. The journey to the house that morning would later feature prominently in Bradstreet's testimony. He noted that as they approached the property, the usual sounds of the countryside, bird calls, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, seemed muted. The house itself appeared intact from the exterior, showing no signs of damage or disturbance. However, both men reported feeling a marked reluctance to approach the front door, a hesitation they could not rationally explain. They found the front door unlocked. Inside, the house was cold and silent. The constable's report, filed with the county court, describes finding Prudence Pemberton's body in the upstairs bedchamber. She appeared to have died in her sleep, lying peacefully in bed with her hands folded across her chest. The room showed no signs of disturbance. However, several details struck the investigators as unusual. The bedchamber door had been locked from the inside, with the key still in the lock. A candle on the bedside table had burned down completely, the wax pooled around its base, suggesting it had burned for many hours. And on the floor beside the bed lay the brass key that witnesses had seen Cornelius clutch during his final illness. Dr. Worthington, summoned to examine the body, estimated death had occurred approximately 48 hours prior. He noted that while Prudence had been in declining health, suffering from joint ailments and digestive complaints, there was no obvious cause of sudden death. The attending circumstances suggested natural causes, though the physician expressed puzzlement at the expression on the deceased's face, which he described in his notes as peculiarly rigid, as if frozen in a moment of profound realization. The eyes, though closed, appear to have been opened at the moment of death and then manually shut, as evidenced by slight bruising on the eyelids, consistent with firm pressure. Most curious is the position of the hands, which appear to have been deliberately arranged post-mortem, as rigor mortis would not produce such precise placement. The servants were nowhere to be found. Their personal belongings remained in their quarters, but Ezra Hutchins and Margaret Wolcott had apparently departed without taking their possessions. This detail troubled Constable Merritt, who initiated inquiries. Neither servant was seen in the immediate area, though a stagecoach driver later reported that 2 individuals matching their descriptions had boarded his coach heading east toward Rhode Island on the evening of February 25th. They carried no luggage and paid their fare in silver coins. The driver remembered them because they sat apart and spoke to no one during the journey, and because both appeared extremely agitated, constantly looking back toward the road they had traveled. Additional testimony came from the driver's assistant, who recalled that when they stopped at a tavern in Lebanon, Connecticut, he attempted to engage the male passenger in conversation. The man reportedly said only, "We honored our part of the arrangement. We fulfilled the terms. What happens now is not our concern." When pressed for clarification, he refused to speak further. The female passenger was observed writing something on a piece of paper, which she then burned in the tavern's fireplace, watching to ensure every fragment was consumed by the flames. The mystery deepened when authorities conducted a more thorough examination of the house. In the kitchen, they found preparations for 3 meals that had never been consumed. Bread dough left to rise and now spoiled, vegetables cut but not cooked, a pot of water still sitting on the cold stove. In the servants' quarters, personal items lay scattered, as if abandoned in haste. Margaret's chamber contained a partially packed trunk, suggesting she had intended to organize her departure, but then fled precipitously. Among the scattered items was a prayer book with numerous passages underlined, particularly sections related to spiritual protection and deliverance from evil. Most significantly, in the cellar, the locked door that had been noted during the estate inventory stood open. This discovery sent both the constable and the deacon into immediate conference. Neither man was eager to explore beyond that threshold, but duty compelled them to investigate. What they found would become the subject of intense speculation and limited documentation. Constable Merritt's official report states only that the secured portion of the cellar contained various materials and objects of uncertain purpose, and that the space exhibited conditions suggestive of long-term use for purposes unknown. He declined to provide additional details in the written record, noting instead that certain findings would be communicated verbally to appropriate authorities. The report does mention that both he and Deacon Bradstreet emerged from the cellar in a state of considerable distress, and that the constable immediately ordered the door sealed with the heaviest available lock and posted a guard to ensure no one entered the property until the county magistrate could be notified. However, a letter written by Deacon Bradstreet to his brother in Massachusetts, dated March 10, 1795, offers more information. The letter, discovered in a private collection in 1962, describes what Bradstreet saw when he accompanied officials into the secured cellar area. The chamber beyond the door descended by stone steps into darkness. The constable and I carried lamps, but the space seemed to resist illumination, our lights casting shadows that moved contrary to reason. The walls were stone, but different from the foundation above, older, perhaps from an earlier structure, or brought from some other location. The stones themselves appeared ancient, weathered in a way that suggested not merely age, but exposure to elements that should not exist in a sealed underground space. The letter continues, there were markings carved into the stone, symbols neither of us recognized. They appeared to be neither European nor Native American in origin, bearing instead resemblance to patterns I have seen in books describing artifacts from distant islands and ancient civilizations. The carvings were deep and precise, suggesting not casual decoration, but deliberate purpose. Some appeared relatively fresh, while others showed the wear of considerable age, implying that this space had been marked and remarked over an extended period. Bradstreet's description becomes more detailed. The floor was dirt, but swept clean with an almost obsessive precision. Not a single stone or debris marred its surface. In the center stood a table of rough wood, unremarkable in construction, but positioned with geometric exactness. Upon this table were arranged various items in a manner suggesting ritual significance rather than practical storage. Books in languages I could not identify. The script appeared to be a mixture of familiar alphabets rendered in unfamiliar combinations. Instruments of purpose unclear, fashioned from materials including brass, iron, and what appeared to be bone. Containers holding substances I preferred not to examine closely, their contents having long since solidified or desiccated, leaving residues that stained the vessels in patterns of deep red and black. The letter becomes more disturbing. More troubling were the records we found. Cornelius had kept a ledger hidden in a cavity in the wall behind a loose stone. The ledger detailed transactions extending back to 1766, the year before construction of the current house. Names, dates, amounts paid, and services rendered, though the nature of these services was described in terms so oblique as to be nearly incomprehensible. Some entries referenced the arrangement with the guardian. Others mentioned tributes paid in the designated manner, and several noted renewals of the covenant. The most recent entry was from September of 1794. Written in a shaking hand, quite unlike Cornelius's usual script, it read, "The arrangement must continue. She understands what is required. The guardian accepts no excuses, no delays, no substitutions. Terms agreed upon in 1766 remain in force. Should the covenant be broken, consequences detailed in the original agreement shall be enacted without mercy or appeal." Bradstreet's letter includes a final observation. The air in that chamber possessed a peculiar quality, not precisely foul, but deeply unsettling, as if the space had absorbed something over many years, and now exhaled it slowly. The constable remarked that he felt as though we were being observed, though we were manifestly alone. I cannot dismiss this feeling as mere imagination, for I experienced it as well, a sensation of scrutiny from a perspective that was neither above nor beside us, but somehow beneath, as if we stood above something that watched through the very earth. The letter concludes, the constable ordered the door sealed. He stated that certain matters were beyond his authority to address, and that the county magistrate would need to determine the proper course of action. But I cannot rid myself of what I saw in that cellar, nor the expression on poor Prudence's face when we found her. It was not peace, it was something else entirely, resignation perhaps, or completion, as if she had fulfilled a terrible obligation and could now rest, however tormented that rest might be. The subsequent investigation, such as it was, proceeded slowly. The county magistrate, Lemuel Thornton, visited the property in mid-March. According to his clerk's private journal, discovered in 1951, Thornton spent less than an hour at the site and emerged from his inspection of the cellar noticeably pale and unwilling to discuss what he had seen. His official determination, recorded in court documents, declared that Prudence Pemberton had died of natural causes and that the secured cellar contained only antiquated business records and personal effects of no public concern. He ordered the cellar door permanently sealed with masonry and the matter closed. This conclusion satisfied few who had knowledge of the case. Dr. Worthington, in a private journal entry from April 1795, expressed skepticism. The magistrate's haste to close this matter suggests external pressure or personal reluctance to pursue uncomfortable truths. I stand by my medical findings regarding Prudence's death, but I cannot explain the circumstances surrounding it. The human body sometimes fails without clear cause, yet the context here suggests a narrative beyond my professional understanding. I have noted similarities between the symptoms exhibited by Cornelius in his final days and certain historical accounts I have read of individuals said to be under spiritual oppression. However, as a man of science, I hesitate to give voice to such speculation. The doctor's journal contains an additional entry dated April the 20th, 1795. I have been troubled by dreams since my involvement in the Pemberton affair. In these dreams, I stand in that cellar chamber, surrounded by darkness that seems to possess weight and texture. I hear voices speaking in languages I do not understand, yet somehow their meaning penetrates my consciousness. They speak of bargains made and prices paid, of agreements that bind beyond death, of guardians who demand their due. I wake from these dreams with a sensation of cold that takes hours to dispel. I have resolved to speak no more of this matter and to discourage others from pursuing investigations. Some knowledge, I now believe, carries dangers that exceed its value. The estate went through probate, and in the absence of heirs, the bulk of the Pemberton assets were liquidated. The property itself proved difficult to sell. Potential buyers expressed concerns about the house's isolated location and the rumored circumstances of the previous owner's death. Real estate records show that the asking price was reduced 3 times over the course of a year before a buyer emerged. Eventually, in late 1796, a buyer was found, a merchant from Boston named Gideon Blackwell, who had no knowledge of local rumors and purchased the property at a significantly reduced price. Blackwell's correspondence, preserved in a Boston Historical Society, includes letters to his business partner describing his intentions for the property. He planned to use it as a base for expanding his trade operations into Connecticut and western Massachusetts. The house seemed ideal, substantial, well-constructed, and surprisingly affordable. The Blackwell family's tenure at the former Pemberton estate was brief. According to tax records, they resided there for approximately 11 months before relocating back to Massachusetts. Blackwell's correspondence includes a letter to his business partner explaining the move. The house proved unsuitable for our needs. My wife found the atmosphere oppressive, and the servants refused to remain in our employ, citing disturbances they could not adequately describe. There were sounds at night that defied explanation, not the ordinary settling of old timber, but something more deliberate, as if the structure itself were restless. The sounds came primarily from beneath the house, emanating from the sealed cellar door. Despite the heavy masonry seal, we detected odors and occasional disturbances that made the lower level unusable for storage. The letter continues with more specific observations. Most troubling was an incident in January of 1797. My eldest son, then aged 19, took it upon himself to investigate the cellar despite my instructions to leave it undisturbed. He managed to loosen several stones in the masonry seal and claimed to have seen into the chamber beyond. He emerged after only moments, refusing to speak of what he observed. That night, he developed a fever that no physician could explain or treat effectively. He survived, thank Providence, but remained in a state of profound disorientation for several weeks. Even now, months later, he refuses to discuss what occurred and has developed an aversion to enclosed spaces that has made him unable to pursue his intended career in my business. I lost more in selling the property than I care to calculate, but some bargains extract costs beyond the monetary. The property changed hands twice more in quick succession, each owner staying less than a year. The second owner, a farmer named Josiah Mercer, left behind only a brief notation in his personal account book. House unsuitable. Moving to father's property in Glastonbury. Wife refuses to remain another night. Loss on sale acceptable, given circumstances. The third owner, whose identity is recorded only as J. Whitmore, merchant, appears in tax records for 8 months before the property was listed as abandoned. By 1800, the house stood empty. Local residents reported that the structure deteriorated rapidly, far more quickly than abandoned buildings typically do. The roof developed leaks, windows broke, and vegetation began reclaiming the cleared land. But no one disturbed the sealed cellar door. A local legend developed among children that the house was haunted, though their parents, many of whom remembered the Pembertons, discouraged such talk. The warnings seemed motivated less by desire to prevent superstition than by genuine unease at drawing attention to the property. In 1806, a fire of undetermined origin destroyed the main house. The town's volunteer fire brigade responded, but made no serious attempt to save the structure. Their efforts focused instead on preventing the fire from spreading to nearby properties. The captain of the brigade, Nathaniel Pierce, noted in his log that the fire burned with unusual intensity and that the smoke produced a smell that caused several of his men to become nauseous. He also observed that the fire seemed unable to fully consume the stone walls of the ground floor, which stood amidst the ruins long after the wooden upper structure had been reduced to ash. The sealed cellar, protected by its stone construction, survived intact. County authorities decided to leave the ruins as they were, given the lack of interest in redeveloping the site. However, They did post notices warning against trespassing, citing structural instability. These notices remained in place for decades, though the ruins showed no signs of imminent collapse. The property remained abandoned for decades. The surrounding forest gradually encroached on what had been cleared land. By the 1830s, few residents remembered the Pemberton name or the events of 1795. The ruins became a curiosity noted in local histories as the remnant of an old merchant's house, with no mention of the circumstances that had made it notorious. The sealed cellar entrance became covered by fallen timbers from the destroyed upper floors, then by accumulated leaves and debris, and finally by creeping vegetation. However, occasional incidents kept the site from being entirely forgotten. In 1823, two hunters tracking deer through the area reported that their dogs refused to approach the ruins, becoming agitated and howling when their owners attempted to lead them closer. In 1837, a surveying party mapping the area for a proposed canal route noted in their field journal that compasses behaved erratically near the old Pemberton site, with needles spinning or pointing in directions that did not correspond to magnetic north. The chief surveyor recommended routing the canal elsewhere, citing geological anomalies that might affect construction stability. In 1854, during construction of the Hartford and Connecticut Western Railroad, workers digging near the old Pemberton site unearthed the sealed cellar entrance. Foreman Daniel Prescott noted the discovery in his daily log, but decided against investigating, citing the need to maintain construction schedules. However, his log includes an annotation. Several of the laborers refused to work near the ruins after the cellar entrance was exposed. They reported hearing sounds from below ground, rhythmic striking, as if something was attempting to communicate in measured beats. Dismissed this as superstition initially, but I cannot deny that work in that section proceeded with unusual difficulty. Equipment failures, injuries from falling tools, and a general sense of unease plagued the crew. I also observed that the atmosphere near the site became noticeably colder, regardless of the summer heat, as if the earth itself was exhaling winter. Prescott's log continues. On the third day of work in that section, one of the laborers, a reliable man named Patrick Murphy, climbed out of the excavation and refused to return. He stated that while working, he had felt something grasp his ankle from beneath the earth, though his companions insisted nothing was visible, and that he must have snagged his boot on a root or stone. Murphy showed us his ankle, which bore marks consistent with fingers, 4 distinct impressions above the ankle bone, and a thumbprint below. He departed the work site immediately and, to my knowledge, never returned to railroad construction. I assigned the remainder of that section to different crews and advanced the schedule to complete the work as quickly as possible. Mate. The railroad was completed on schedule, running approximately 200 yards south of the Pemberton ruins. The exposed cellar entrance was covered with earth and debris from the construction, reburying whatever remained below. However, workers on the railroad noted for years afterward that passing trains would occasionally experience unexplained slowdowns in that section, with engineers reporting that engines seemed to lose power despite showing no mechanical faults. These slowdowns occurred most frequently during winter months, particularly in late February. The most significant attempt to investigate the site occurred in 1923, when Harold Pendleton, an instructor of history at Yale University, learned of the Pemberton case while researching Connecticut merchant families of the colonial period. Pendleton obtained permission from the current landowner to conduct an archaeological examination of the ruins. His initial survey, documented in field notes preserved at Yale's Sterling Memorial Library, identified the approximate location of the sealed cellar. Pendleton's research methodology was thorough. He spent 3 months reviewing available documentation, interviewing descendants of families who had lived in the area during the 1790s, and conducting preliminary surveys of the site. His notes reveal a scholar both intrigued by the historical mystery and skeptical of supernatural explanations. He wrote, "The Pemberton case presents a fascinating study in how local legends develop around unexplained deaths and abandoned properties. My goal is to separate fact from folklore and determine what actually occurred in 1795. I suspect we will find evidence of smuggling or other illicit activities that the Pembertons wish to conceal, possibly involving trade with French interests during the Revolutionary period." Pendleton organized a small excavation in August of 1923, employing 3 laborers from a local construction company. Contemporary accounts identify these men as brothers named Curtis, Douglas, and William Talbot, all experienced in excavation work. They worked for 5 days, clearing vegetation and removing accumulated soil from the stone foundation. Pendleton's notes from these initial days are detailed and optimistic, describing the careful exposure of the foundation walls and the location of what he believed to be the sealed entrance. On the 6th day, they located the sealed entrance. Pendleton's notes describe a masonry barrier that appeared intact, constructed of the same stone as the foundation. He noted that the mortar between the stones was of exceptional quality, showing minimal deterioration despite more than a century of exposure. The decision to breach the seal was not made lightly. Pendleton consulted with the landowner and obtained written permission to proceed. He also notified the Yale History Department of his intentions and arranged for a photographer to document the findings. What happened next is documented only fragmentarily. Pendleton's field notes end abruptly with an entry dated August 18, 1923. Barrier removed after considerable effort. The mortar proved more resilient than anticipated, requiring most of the day to safely dismantle enough stones to permit entry. Stone steps visible, descending into darkness. Air emerging from opening has distinctive odor, not decay, but something else, something preserved, unlike any smell I have encountered in previous archaeological work. Temperature of air significantly colder than ambient summer heat. Team preparing to enter with lanterns and surveying equipment. Douglas Talbot expressed reluctance, claiming to feel unwell, but agreed to proceed after brief rest. No subsequent entries appear in the recovered notebooks. The photographer, who was scheduled to arrive on August 19th, found the excavation site abandoned, with tools scattered and lanterns still sitting where they had been placed. The stones that had been removed from the sealed entrance lay in a pile nearby, but the entrance itself stood open, revealing only darkness. The photographer, a man named Arthur Chen, reported the situation to local authorities and refused to approach the opening himself. The local newspaper, the Hartford Courant, published a brief notice on August 23, 1923, reporting that Yale instructor Harold Pendleton had been found wandering along the post road near the Farmington River, approximately 3 miles from the excavation site. He was described as disoriented and unable to provide coherent answers to questions about his whereabouts over the previous 4 days. His clothing was torn and muddied, and he showed signs of dehydration and exposure. The 3 laborers he had employed were never located. Extensive searches were conducted for the Talbot brothers. Local police, supplemented by volunteers from the community, combed the area around the Pemberton site for a week. No trace of the 3 men was ever found. No bodies, no evidence of foul play, no indication of where they might have gone. Their families, interviewed extensively by authorities, could provide no explanation. All 3 men were described as reliable, family-oriented individuals with no history of disappearance or unexplained behavior. Hospital records obtained through a later research request filed in 1962 indicate that Pendleton gradually regained normal cognitive function, but retained no memory of events following the opening of the sealed cellar. He reported only fragments, darkness, cold, and a persistent sense of being observed by something that existed in a state he could not adequately describe, something that was simultaneously absent and oppressively present. Medical staff noted that he exhibited symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma, including acute anxiety, disrupted sleep patterns, and an aversion to enclosed spaces. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Feldman, preserved private notes about Pendleton's case. These notes, discovered among his papers after his death in 1957, reveal concerns beyond standard medical observations. Patient exhibits physical symptoms inconsistent with simple exposure and dehydration. Bruising on wrists and ankles suggests restraint, but patient insists he was never bound. More troubling are the markings on his back, 3 parallel scratches running from shoulder blade to lower back on each side, too precise and symmetrical to be from branches or rocks. When asked about these marks, patient becomes extremely agitated, insisting they were not present before he entered the cellar. Patient also exhibits aversion to certain sounds, particularly rhythmic tapping or knocking, which causes immediate anxiety responses. Dr. Feldman's notes continue. Patient's amnesia appears genuine rather than psychological suppression. However, he reports dreams that may represent recovered fragments of memory. In these dreams, he describes descending stone steps into a chamber that seemed larger than the house's foundation could contain. He speaks of walls covered in markings that hurt to look at, of artifacts arranged with geometric precision, of a sense that the space existed in more dimensions than the 3 we commonly experience. Most disturbing are his descriptions of feeling that something in that chamber recognized him, knew him, and attempted to communicate through means that no human faculty was designed to receive. Pendleton returned to Yale in September, but resigned his position within a month. He relocated to his family's home in Maine and never returned to Connecticut. He lived until 1967, working as a librarian in Portland and never returning to historical research. In a letter to a colleague dated October 1923, preserved in Yale's archives, he wrote, "I cannot explain what occurred at that site, nor do I wish to try. Some investigations uncover knowledge we are better without. My advice, which I offer with utmost sincerity, is to leave that place undisturbed. Whatever the Pembertons were involved with, it did not end with their deaths. I have come to believe that Cornelius and Prudence were not villains but victims, or perhaps guardians who fulfilled a terrible responsibility. The arrangement they maintained may have been more protection than prison." Following Pendleton's experience, the excavation site was abandoned and eventually refilled, though it is unclear who ordered or performed this work. Local residents reported seeing activity at the site during late August 1923, but descriptions varied wildly. Some claimed to have seen workers refilling the excavation. Others reported seeing figures moving around the site at night when no legitimate work would be conducted, and several insisted they saw nothing, but found the excavation filled when they checked the site days later. The landowner subsequently sold the property, and it passed through several transactions before being subdivided in the 1940s for residential development. However, the area where the Pemberton house once stood became part of a conservation easement, designated as unsuitable for building due to unstable soil conditions, though geological surveys conducted in 1938 and again in 1956 found no evidence of instability. The explanation for this designation appears nowhere in official records. In 1967, during routine survey work for a proposed highway extension, state engineers noted an anomaly in ground-penetrating radar scans. The readings suggested a substantial void beneath the surface in the area corresponding to the old Pemberton property. A geologist consulted on the project, Dr. Vincent Ashford, documented his findings in a technical report. Subsurface imaging indicates a chamber of significant dimensions, approximately 20 feet by 30 feet and extending at least 15 feet below grade. The void appears to be artificial in origin, with structured walls rather than natural cave formation. However, the surrounding soil shows compaction patterns inconsistent with typical construction excavation. The chamber appears older than the colonial-era structures known to have existed at this location, possibly predating European settlement. Dr. Ashford's report included recommendations. The presence of this void presents potential complications for highway construction. However, I must note unusual aspects of the survey data that exceed my expertise to interpret. Radar returns from the chamber exhibit patterns I have not encountered in 30 years of geological survey work. The readings suggest the chamber's dimensions vary depending on the angle and frequency of the survey equipment, as if the space does not conform to conventional geometric principles. I recommend consultation with specialists in archaeology and possibly physics before proceeding with any construction that might disturb this area. Dr. Ashford recommended further investigation to ensure the stability of any proposed construction. However, the highway project was canceled for unrelated budgetary reasons before additional surveys could be conducted. His report was filed with the State Engineering Office and subsequently lost during an office reorganization in 1968. Dr. Ashford himself, interviewed in 1966 as part of a different research project, made oblique reference to his work at the Pemberton site, stating only, "I have encountered many unusual geological formations in my career, but that location presented readings that challenged my understanding of subsurface structures. I was not disappointed when the project was canceled." The final documented reference to the Pemberton case appears in a footnote in a 1969 doctoral dissertation by Margaret Sawyer, a graduate student in American history at the University of Connecticut. Sawyer's dissertation examined merchant families in colonial New England and included a brief section on unexplained disappearances and suspicious deaths. She noted the Pemberton case as an example of incomplete historical records and speculated that the sealed cellar might have contained evidence of illicit trade or smuggling operations that family members wished to conceal. Sawyer attempted to locate surviving documents related to the case, but found that many records had been lost or destroyed. Hartford County Court documents from the 1790s were incomplete, with several volumes missing from the archives. The Pemberton family papers, if they ever existed as a collected set, could not be found. Even church records from the First Church of Hartford showed gaps for the relevant period. In her dissertation notes, Sawyer observed, "The absence of documentation is itself suggestive. Either the records were systematically removed, or they were never intended to be preserved. In either case, the silence surrounding the Pemberton affair speaks to deliberate obscuration." Today, the area where Cornelius and Prudence Pemberton once lived is marked by mature forest. A small conservation trail passes within a quarter-mile of the site, used by hikers and bird watchers who have no knowledge of the property's history. The precise location of the house foundation has been lost to overgrowth and the passage of time. No marker indicates that anything of significance occurred there. Yet the story persists in local historical societies, passed along as one of Connecticut's minor mysteries. A wealthy merchant family, sudden deaths, rumors of something hidden, and a sealed cellar that no one dared to fully investigate. The details have been compressed and altered through retellings, reduced to ghost story elements, disconnected from the documented facts. What actually lay beyond that sealed cellar door? What was the nature of Cornelius Pemberton's obligations that required continuation beyond his death? Why did Prudence ultimately open the door she had been instructed to leave secured? What became of the servants who fled, or of the laborers who entered the cellar with Harold Pendleton in 1923? And what was the true nature of the arrangement that Cornelius had made in 1766 before construction of the house that would become his family's prison and tomb? The historical record offers no definitive answers. We have only fragments, court documents, private letters, medical notes, and the persistent testimony of those who encountered something they could not or would not fully describe. The patterns suggest something more than ordinary tragedy or criminal activity, something that resisted conventional documentation and explanation. Perhaps the most telling detail is the consistency of responses across 2 centuries. Those who approached the sealed cellar with investigative intent, whether the constable and deacon in 1795, the various property owners in subsequent decades, or the academic researcher in 1923, all retreated with similar reluctance to describe what they had found. The silence is too uniform to be coincidental, suggesting not ignorance, but a shared recognition that some discoveries should not be shared. The Pemberton wealth came from trade, but trade requires exchanges, value given for value received. The hidden ledger described transactions that extended back decades, arrangements that Cornelius felt obligated to maintain even in death. What was being traded, and with whom, or perhaps more accurately, with what? The documents reference the guardian, an entity that accepted tributes, enforced covenants, and demanded fulfillment of agreements made decades earlier. The markings in the cellar, described as neither European nor Native American, suggest influences from elsewhere, perhaps from the Caribbean, where Cornelius had traveled in 1766, or from older sources that predated European arrival in the Americas. These questions remain unanswered. The sealed cellar, if it still exists beneath the surface of that Connecticut hillside, keeps its secrets, and perhaps that is how it should remain. The historical record teaches us not only what happened, but sometimes what should not be pursued. The case officially remains classified in Hartford County Archives as an unexplained death with property irregularities. No investigation has been reopened. No excavation has been authorized. The land continues to be designated unsuitable for development, protected by regulations that ensure it will remain undisturbed. On quiet evenings, when the wind moves through the forests along the Farmington River, some residents claim they can hear sounds carried on the air, rhythmic, methodical, as if something below the earth is still keeping time, still waiting for obligations to be honored. Hikers on the conservation trail occasionally report feeling sudden temperature drops, experiencing disorientation, or hearing sounds that seem to come from beneath their feet. These reports are dismissed by authorities as natural phenomena, the product of unusual acoustic conditions and psychological suggestion. But the reports persist, and they share common elements with testimonies from 1795 and 1923, the sensation of being observed, the cold that emanates from the earth itself, the sounds that suggest communication without words, and the overwhelming conviction that whatever resides in that place has been there longer than the Pembertons, longer than European settlement, perhaps longer than can be comfortably contemplated. The Pemberton family is gone. Their house is ruins buried under decades of growth. The sealed door, wherever it now rests, remains closed, or at least we hope it remains closed. And whatever Cornelius and Prudence Pemberton understood in the end, whatever made them guardians of that locked chamber, died with them in 1795. Or at least, that is what the documented evidence suggests. But documents can be lost, records can be destroyed, and sometimes the absence of information reveals more than its presence. The Pembertons left behind a fortune that no one wanted, a house that could not be inhabited, and a secret that continues to repel investigation after more than 2 centuries. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some doors remain sealed for good reason, and some obligations, once undertaken, persist beyond death, waiting in darkness for terms to be fulfilled. The arrangement that Cornelius Pemberton made in 1766 specified no end date, no termination clause. It simply continued, maintained first by Cornelius, then by Prudence, and perhaps maintained still by the land itself, which has absorbed the weight of whatever covenant was sworn beneath that house. The final word belongs to Harold Pendleton in a letter written shortly before his death in 1967, found among his effects by his daughter. I have carried the weight of that August day for 44 years. What I cannot remember consciously haunts my dreams with sufficient clarity to understand, if not to articulate. The Pembertons were offered something by something, and they accepted. The price seemed distant, perhaps theoretical, but prices must eventually be paid, and the payment required was ongoing, generational, eternal. When Prudence died, the arrangement did not end. It simply waited, and it waits still, patient beyond human comprehension, secure in the knowledge that time means nothing to that which does not experience time as we do. My advice to anyone who might consider investigating: do not. Leave it sealed, leave it forgotten. Some guardians protect us from threats we should never acknowledge, and the Pembertons, whatever their initial motivation, ultimately served that function. Let them rest in whatever peace their service earned them.